Listen closely. You can still hear the iron rhythm of legionary boots echoing through the dust of Judea. The year is 70 CE, and the empire has decided that defiance must be turned into a lesson, etched not in parchment, but in blood and ash. What happens when a superpower chooses annihilation over negotiation? What happens when a city that refuses to kneel becomes an example to the world? Before the flames, there was order, Roman order, that cold geometry of roads, taxes, and tribute. And under it pressure, priests divided, zealots armed, a people torn between faith and survival. Vespasian began the hammer's swing. Titus finished it. Their legions moved like a machine with a single purpose, to make rebellion unthinkable for 1,000 years. Siege towers rolled forward. Ramparts rose from the earth like jagged teeth, and the city's walls, once a sanctuary, became a trap with no exits. Inside Jerusalem, hope starved first. Grain stores dwindled, then disappeared. An invisible army, hunger, marched faster than any cohort, stripping flesh from the living long before swords could. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Water became a currency more precious than gold. The streets fell silent except for the weeping and the whisper of prayers. Prayers that were met with the hard fact of encircling legions and the relentless thud of battering rams. The Romans knew how to break a city without stepping inside it. They choked it. They cut the roads, the aqueducts, the fields. Anyone who tried to flee found a new Rome waiting beyond the walls, crosses like a forest, patrols like wolves, and a boundary of fear that stretched farther than any trench. The message was plain. No one leaves. Not alive. And still the defenders stood. Still the Temple Hill gleamed, defiant, sacred, doomed. Imagine standing on the ramparts at dawn, a horizon of standards, eagle-topped and motionless as if the gods themselves had arrived to witness punishment. Trumpets cried, ladders slammed, stones howled from siege engines that hurled boulders like small moons. The city answered with fire, oil, curses, and desperate stones of its own. But desperation is a finite resource. Discipline is not. Rome had more time, more men, more iron, more hunger to inflict than Jerusalem had strength to endure. When the breach came, it did not come all at once. It crept. A wall section yielded, then another. Streets that once carried pilgrims now carried soldiers who understood that terror was as useful as steel. House by house, step by step, the city's map was rewritten in smoke. The temple, heart of a people, stood like a challenge to fate. And Rome does not accept challenges, not from kings, not from prophets, not from rebels who believe heaven will open for them if they hold one more day. Ask yourself, was this justice, order restored by the sword? Or was it a ritual of dominance, an empire teaching the world that pain is the price of disobedience? The answer depends on where you stand. Outside, the walls with the standards, or inside them with the starving. If the story you've just entered chills you, if it forces you to question what power does when it fears humiliation, I want to hear your voice. Drop a comment with your first reaction. Shock, rage, sorrow. Hit like if you want more unflinching history told without varnish. And subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the darkest corridors of the ancient world. The past is not dead. It's marching, and it's closer than you think. Before the flames consumed Jerusalem, there was a moment, a spark almost invisible, when rebellion became inevitable. It began not with a sword, but with a sneer. A Roman governor, arrogant and indifferent, mocking the laws of a people he did not understand. The Jews of the province had long endured the empire's taxes, its soldiers, its idols carved into every corner of their land. But every empire has a threshold where obedience turns to despair, and despair to fury. The spark was named Tertius Florus, the Roman procurator of Judea. His cruelty was not extraordinary by Roman standards, but it was personal, deliberate. He stole temple funds. He flogged priests. He crucified men for minor insults and laughed as their families watched. Each act tore another seam in the fragile fabric that held Rome and Judea together. Soon, it would rip entirely. In the streets of Jerusalem, whispers turned to shouts. Markets once filled with merchants and pilgrims now echoed with calls for vengeance. The zealots, fanatics born of humiliation, rose from the shadows proclaiming that submission to Rome was treason against God. They were not soldiers, not yet. They were men with faith sharper than any blade, and hunger deeper than fear. They believed that if they struck first, heaven itself would intervene. Rome answered with fire. Legions marched from Syria, their standards gleaming like omens of death. Villages burned before the soldiers even dismounted. The message was clear. Rebellion would be met not with negotiation but extinction. Yet each village destroyed became another altar of defiance, each crucifixion another sermon in blood. The more Rome punished, the stronger the faith of the condemned became. And faith, when cornered, becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. Inside the temple, priests debated whether to appease or resist. The young demanded purity, the old begged for reason. But reason is a fragile thing in a room full of wounds. The zealots seized the moment. They slaughtered the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, their swords red with the certainty of divine justice. For one brief night, the city was free, and doomed. To the Romans, this was not rebellion. It was blasphemy against the natural order, an insult to the gods of conquest. Vespasian, a general carved from stone and strategy, was sent to erase not merely an army, but an idea that a province could defy the center of the world. He marched methodically, turning cities into warnings. Sepphoris Jotapata, Tarichei, names that once sang with life now swallowed by silence. And among the survivors, rumors spread that Jerusalem would be next. Imagine it, a people praying for deliverance, even as smoke from nearby towns blackened their skies. Mothers teaching children to whisper psalms while preparing to flee. Old men clutching scrolls that told of deliverance from Egypt, hoping that history might repeat itself. But this time Pharaoh was Rome, and there would be no sea to part, no prophet to lead them out. Only walls, hunger, and the endless horizon of an empire that could not afford to forgive. The spark had become a fire that would consume the city, the temple, and the dreams of an entire generation. The legions did not move like armies. They moved like inevitability. To face them was to face the logic of conquest itself, cold, precise, merciless. Each man was a cog in a living engine built to erase resistance from the map of the world. When Rome went to war, it did not simply aim to win. It aimed to make the very thought of defiance an act of madness. As Vespasian advanced through Judea, his soldiers marched in perfect rhythm, the beat of iron-shod sandals blending with the rumble of siege engines dragged by oxen. Roads were carved from the bones of the land, supply lines stretching back to the coast like veins pumping lifeblood into a mechanical beast. Behind them followed engineers, smiths, carpenters, an army of builders devoted to destruction. Every nail, every stone, every timber had a purpose: to feed the hunger of Rome's war machine. The legions were not only soldiers, they were artisans of annihilation. They built fortresses overnight, dug trenches that swallowed entire armies, and raised walls that strangled cities. Their discipline was absolute. No mercy, no hesitation. They killed with geometry, with perfect formations that turned chaos into choreography. A rebel charge might seem brave, but to Rome it was just another equation, to be solved in blood. Vespasian's strategy was not to storm the Judean cities head-on, but to suffocate them one by one. He struck like a surgeon, cutting the land into isolated fragments, severing communication, hope, and food. Each fortress that fell became a model for the next. The Romans studied resistance as if it were a science, adapting with inhuman precision. They learned the rhythms of the rebels' faith and used it against them, attacking during their Sabbaths, burning granaries when Fasting began. Nothing was sacred to an empire that worshipped only control. Those who surrendered were branded, enslaved, or crucified. Those who resisted were buried under the weight of Roman engineering. From the coastal plains to the mountains of Galilee, villages vanished into the smoke. The earth itself seemed to bleed as fields were trampled and aqueducts shattered. Rome's banners fluttered in the wind, each one a silent decree. This land belongs to order, and yet beneath the thunder of discipline and the glare of imperial glory, something darker pulsed, a kind of sacred cruelty. The legions believed they were instruments of fate. To them, the destruction of Jerusalem was not merely conquest, it was purification. They saw themselves as the fire through which the world was forged anew. In that belief lay the true horror of Rome, the conviction that slaughter could be holy. By the time the Judean rebels retreated into Jerusalem, the machine had already decided their fate. There, courage meant nothing to the calculus of empire. They would be encircled, starved, and erased, one calculated step at a time. The legions would not rest until the dust of the holy city joined the dust of every other dream Rome had crushed. The city that once glimmered like a crown of faith now stood as a fortress of desperation. Jerusalem, holy, proud, wounded, was surrounded. The legions of Titus, son of Vespasian, had arrived to finish what his father began. From the Mount of Olives to the Iao, valleys below, Roman camps burned with the steady glow of discipline. Inside the walls, prayers turned into screams. The siege began not with thunder, but with silence. The kind of silence that swells before collapse. The Romans built their ring of iron slowly, methodically, choking the city like a predator toying with its prey. Watchtowers rose, siege ramps grew from the earth, and every gate became a mirror of doom. No food entered, no soul escaped. The air itself became a weapon, thick with smoke, rot, and the stench of death. Inside, factions tore the city apart. Zealots fought priests, fanatics murdered moderates, and fire consumed the very grain that could have sustained them. What Rome had not yet destroyed, the defenders themselves began to devour. Streets became battlefields, sanctuaries turned to slaughterhouses. And amid it all, the temple, once a beacon of divine presence, watched as its own people tore each other to shreds. Hunger soon became a god of its own. Mothers wept over empty bowls. Children wasted into ghosts. There were stories, whispers too terrible to speak aloud, of the unthinkable things done to survive. Each night, the city's silence was broken by the rhythm of picks and hammers from outside, as Roman engineers drove their machines closer and closer. Each dawn, the walls trembled beneath the impact of stones hurled by catapults that screamed through the air like angry spirits. Titus offered surrender. He promised life to those who yielded, but the zealots spat at his mercy. To them, surrender was blasphemy. Better to die as martyrs than live as slaves. So the Romans waited. They waited and watched as the city devoured itself from within. Every moment of defiance was another verse in a hymn to despair. Then came the fire. Siege towers loomed like wooden giants against the skyline, their sides armored in iron plates, their insides filled with soldiers hungry for vengeance. Arrows darkened the sun, ladders struck the walls. And when the gates finally fell, the earth shook, not from battle but from the screams of the dying. What the Romans entered was no longer a city, it was a tomb. The siege was over, but the horror was only beginning. The soldiers moved through the ruins like scavengers of empire, cutting down anyone who moved. Blood ran through the streets where pilgrims once walked, and atop the Temple Mount, as flames devoured the last sanctuary, Titus stood watching, not in triumph, but in silence. For he knew that history would call this victory divine, but there was nothing divine about it. The ashes of Jerusalem rose to the heavens like a final prayer, one that no god would answer. If you've made it this far, tell me, what do you feel reading this? Rage, grief, disbelief? Leave a comment. I want to know how this vision of the past haunts you. At the heart of the storm stood the temple, the soul of a nation, the axis of faith. It had survived centuries of conquest, desecration, and exile. But now, beneath a red sky and the roar of legionaries, its final hour had come. What burned that night was more than stone and gold. It was identity itself, consumed by the wrath of empire. When the Romans breached the city, their orders were clear: capture the temple, preserve it if possible. But fire has a will of its own, and vengeance burns hotter than discipline. The fighting around the sanctuary was chaos incarnate. Priests wielding knives meant for sacrifice, soldiers trampling over sacred courtyards, smoke coiling through the colonnades like a living thing. The trumpets of the defenders clashed with the horns of the legions, until the sounds fused into one terrible chorus, the death cry of a civilization. The gilded doors of the temple reflected the flames before they succumbed to them. Gold melted, running like rivers through the stones. The curtains, embroidered with the symbols of creation, ignited and vanished. The Holy of Holies, the chamber where no man but the high priest could enter, was torn, open, violated by swords and torches. Roman standards rose where incense once drifted. And as the smoke rose higher, the line between sacrilege and victory dissolved into madness. Titus, they say, tried to stop the destruction. Perhaps he did. Perhaps the god of conquest was simply stronger than the general who bore his name. Soldiers, wild with rage and hunger, ignored every command. They looted, slaughtered, and laughed as they cast corpses into the flames. For them, this was more than war. It was catharsis. The destruction of the temple was the death of rebellion itself, a ritual cleansing in which faith was the offering. From a distance, the scene must have looked apocalyptic. The great sanctuary, visible for miles, collapsing in waves of light and smoke. Pilgrims watching from the hills screamed prayers that vanished into the wind. The city's heart cracked open, releasing not just fire, but the unbearable realization that God's house was gone. Forever. Among the ruins, soldiers found relics, vessels, scrolls, and the sacred menorah. They carried them away as trophies, parading them through the streets like proof that Rome had triumphed over heaven itself. Those who survived whispered that the Shekinah, the divine presence, had risen from the flames and left the world in mourning. By dawn, the temple was nothing but embers and echoes. The air shimmered with heat, and the ground was black with soot. For the first time in 1,000 years, Jerusalem stood without its sanctuary. The covenant between a people and their God had been shattered by iron and arrogance. And as the legions marched away, the ashes behind them whispered a question that would haunt centuries to come. When the holy is destroyed, what becomes of the faithful? When the flames finally died, the silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Jerusalem had become a graveyard of smoke and ash, and yet from its ruins, the Romans began to harvest life. Not mercy, never mercy, but utility. 2. The conquerors, the survivors, were not people. They were spoils. The living remnants of rebellion destined to feed the machinery of empire. Roman soldiers swept through the charred streets, dragging men, women, and children from the rubble. The strong were bound in chains, the weak were left where they fell. Some were executed on the spot, those who looked defiant, those who clung too tightly to their dead. Others were driven together like cattle, herded toward the camps beyond the city walls. There was no dignity left, only the rhythm of whips and the shuffle of bare feet on scorched stone. Thousands were crucified outside the gates, so many that wood became scarce, and the hills themselves seemed to bloom with crosses. The smell of rot and iron filled the wind. To the Romans it was a lesson written in flesh. This is what happens when subjects forget who rules them. Each cross was a monument to obedience, each body a warning to the world. Those who were spared the cross were condemned to chains. Caravans of captives wound their way toward the coast, columns of shadows under the unforgiving sun. Children stumbled beside their parents, their wrists raw from the ropes. Soldiers prodded them forward, laughing, trading jokes about the treasures of Judea. The survivors had become currency. In the markets of Ashkelon, Gaza, and Caesarea, their value was weighed like grain. From there, ships carried them to every corner of the empire, some to the quarries of Egypt, others to the amphitheaters of Antioch and Carthage. The youngest and strongest were reserved for the grandest spectacle of all, the triumph of Titus. They would march in chains through the streets of Rome itself, living proof of imperial power. Behind them, wagons carried the sacred vessels of the temple, the menorah, the trumpets, the golden table, symbols of a faith now humiliated before the eyes of the world. Imagine that parade, the air thick with incense and cheers, while thousands of slaves trudged through the capital of their conquerors. For the Romans, it was a celebration of order restored. For the captives, it was the erasure of identity, the transformation from human to property. Beneath the marble arches, they passed not into freedom, but into oblivion. Some were sold to distant masters. Others were thrown into the arenas, forced to kill or die for the amusement of those who had destroyed their world. The lucky few disappeared into servitude, their names forgotten, their faith smothered beneath years of silence. And yet somewhere in the dust of those forgotten roads defiance endured, a whisper, faint but unbroken. Because even as Rome believed it had extinguished the soul of a nation, the survivors carried its embers within them. Across deserts and seas, through chains and centuries, those embers would wait, silent, smoldering, for the moment when faith would rise again from the ashes of empire. Rome had never forgotten how to celebrate death. When Titus returned, from Judea he did not bring peace, he brought spectacle. The city was alive with fevered anticipation, streets garlanded with laurels, incense burning thick enough to hide the stench of conquest. The people of Rome gathered to witness what the empire called a triumph, the ritual humiliation of a nation reduced to myth. At dawn, the horns sounded. A procession emerged from the shadowed arches, led by the prisoners who had once been priests, scholars, and warriors. Now they shuffled barefoot through the marble avenues, their faces hollow, their chains glinting in the sunlight. Behind them came the wagons, massive, gilded displays bearing the treasures of Jerusalem, the menorah, the golden trumpets, the sacred table of showbread. The same objects that once adorned God's sanctuary now adorned the victory of empire. Titus rode at the center, a conqueror crowned with laurel, the embodiment of Roman glory. The crowd roared his name, showering him with petals and praise. But behind the cheers lurked something darker, admiration not for justice but for annihilation. They did not see the suffering that bled from those chains. They saw only power, the divine right of Rome to decide who lived, who died, and who was forgotten. As the procession wound through the forum, slaves carried placards depicting the destruction of the temple, the flames, the slaughter, the fall of Jerusalem rendered as art. Children laughed as they watched. Senators nodded approvingly. The empire had turned horror into entertainment, grief into theater. The triumph was not just a celebration of victory, it was an erasure, a rewriting of memory in marble and song. At the end of the parade stood the temple of Jupiter, where Titus was to offer his sacrifice. There, the spoils of Judea were laid before the gods of Rome, a symbolic exchange, one faith offered to another, as if to declare that the heavens themselves now bowed to the empire. The priests of Jupiter chanted as the captives looked on, their eyes empty. They were the last witnesses of their world's undoing. When the ceremonies ended, the slaves were led away, some to the markets, others to the arenas. The menorah and the temple vessels disappeared into the imperial treasury, and the Arch of Titus was erected soon after, a monument to victory carved in stone but stained with memory. Even today its reliefs show the spoils, the chains, the procession of despair immortalized as triumph. But history has a way of whispering beneath the carvings. If you stand beneath that arch and listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of the chained captives, the faint clink of iron beneath the roar of the crowd. The empire believed it had silenced them forever. Yet their silence became a haunting, the sound of a people who refused to vanish. Tell me, when you picture that triumph, what do you feel? Leave a comment. Should history remember this day as victory or as vengeance? After the triumph came silence. Not peace, never peace, but the stillness that follows when something sacred has been erased. Jerusalem was gone, its walls reduced to skeletons of stone, its once holy streets buried beneath ash. Only a few towers remained, jagged and black against the sky, like the teeth of a dead god. To walk there was to tread upon memory itself. For Rome, it was victory. For the survivors, it was exile that would never end. Across the empire, the Jewish people became wanderers. Some worked the quarries in Egypt, others toiled in Roman fields or perished in foreign arenas. The smoke of Jerusalem had carried their prayers into the heavens, but the heavens were silent. Their land, once the cradle of their faith, was now a province of ghosts. The scars of destruction were not only carved into stone, they were carved into identity. The Romans left their mark deliberately. They built a new city upon the ruins, naming it Aelia Capitolina. Temples to Jupiter and Venus rose where the temple once stood, as if to remind the world that even the gods of the conquered had been replaced. It was not enough to destroy, they had to overwrite. To Rome, erasure was the purest form of dominance. But scars have a strange way of remembering what caused them. In the whispers of displaced families, in the hidden rituals of forbidden faith, the story of Jerusalem survived. In Babylon, in Alexandria, in Rome itself, the memory of the fallen city became scripture. The songs of mourning turned into prayers of endurance. Every exile who looked toward the east carried a piece of the city within their chest, a wound that refused to heal. And Rome, though triumphant, could never truly silence that wound. Empires thrive on obedience, but memory is a rebellion that never dies. The more the Romans tried to bury the past, the deeper it rooted itself in the souls of the survivors. The destruction of Jerusalem became legend, then prophecy, then identity. It was no longer a city. It was a symbol, a scar shaped like hope. Centuries would pass, emperors would fall, and yet the story endured. The ruins of Jerusalem whispered through time, a reminder that even the mightiest empire cannot conquer remembrance. The marble of Rome has long since cracked, its arches and forums faded into dust. But the memory of that burned city still glows like an ember in the dark. Proof that destruction, no matter how absolute, can never unmake what faith has carved into the human spirit. Rome did not simply conquer with swords, it conquered with stories. After the fall of Jerusalem, the empire began its second campaign, a war of memory. History would be rewritten, sculpted, and paraded through marble and ink to ensure that only Rome's version would endure. The destruction of Judea became a moral tale, told not by the defeated but by the victors who owned the means of remembrance. In the Senate halls and the writings of Roman chroniclers, the rebellion was called madness, the punishment justice. The Jews were portrayed as fanatics, their faith a form of stubborn folly, their destruction the natural outcome of defying civilization. It was not genocide, it was order restored. This was the genius of Rome. It could turn atrocity into virtue simply by narrating it with enough grandeur. Coins were minted bearing the inscription Judea Capta, Judea captured. On one side, the emperor's profile, serene and divine. On the other, a weeping woman beneath a palm tree, her wrists bound, her head bowed. In that single image, the entire world was taught who ruled and who wept. Every transaction across the empire carried the memory of subjugation stamped into its metal. Power was not only held, it was circulated daily through the hands of millions. Monuments told the same story. The Arch of Titus rose in Rome as a triumph carved in stone, depicting soldiers carrying the sacred menorah through the city's heart. To the casual eye, it was art. To those who remembered, it was desecration turned to pride. Travelers walked beneath it for centuries, unaware that they were passing through a tomb of silence. Even religion was absorbed into the machinery. Roman poets and philosophers praised the destruction as the triumph of divine reason over superstition. The gods of empire, they said, had favored Titus because he had restored balance to the world. What was once blasphemy became theology. What was once horror became destiny. Yet beneath that marble propaganda, the truth still breathed. It lived in whispered stories, in songs sung, quietly on foreign shores, in scriptures copied in secret. The empire could carve its narrative into every wall of its capital, but it could not touch the memories carried by the displaced and the devout. Rome's greatest flaw was its arrogance, the belief that fear could erase faith. Centuries later, the Arch of Titus still stands. The coins still survive in museums, gleaming faintly beneath glass. But the empire that created them is dust. The story it tried to control has outlived its authors, and somewhere beyond the ruins and relics, the descendants of the conquered still remember not the power of Rome, but its cruelty. For every empire that writes its victories in stone, there will always be a voice in the shadows whispering the names of the fallen. There is a silence that lingers after great suffering, a silence heavy with questions no empire can answer. In the ruins of Jerusalem, among the stones scorched by fire, that silence became eternal. The rebellion had begun with faith and ended in desolation. The price of resistance was everything: city, temple, nation, and name. Yet within that total loss lies the strange beauty of defiance, the unbroken will of a people who refused to kneel, even as the world burned around them. Rome won the war. That is what the history books say. But victory has its own kind of decay. The empire's triumph was carved into arches and coins, yet its glory depended on the ashes of others. And ashes, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of rising with the wind. Every act of domination carries the seed of remembrance. Every silenced voice becomes a whisper that survives empires. For the Jews who lived, exile became identity. They scattered like embers across the known world, some to Babylon, some to Alexandria, others to the heart of Rome itself. They carried no armies, no banners, only memory. And memory proved stronger than any legion. While Rome's emperors turned to dust, their monuments crumbling into ruin, the story of Jerusalem endured, retold, reinterpreted, reborn. What then was the true cost of rebellion? Was it destruction, or was it immortality? To resist is to risk annihilation, but also to claim the right to one's own story. The Judean rebels lost their city, but they preserved something greater: the proof that human conviction can stand against the machinery of empire, even when the outcome is certain death. Their defeat was written in blood, but their endurance was written in eternity. 2,000 years later, the Arch of Titus still stands, its carvings pale beneath the Roman sun. Tourists walk beneath it, taking pictures of the menorah carved into stone. Few notice the irony that the very monument meant to celebrate annihilation has become a memorial to survival. Rome is gone. The people it tried to erase are not. History is not kind, but it is patient. It remembers everything: the cruelty, the courage, the choices made when surrender seemed easier. The destruction of Jerusalem was not just a tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the nature of power itself. Power conquers, but faith endures, always. If this journey through the ashes of history moved you, subscribe to the channel to join us in uncovering more dark truths from the ancient world. Leave a comment below with the phrase "The Ashes Remember," and when you're ready, watch the next episode, where we descend into another forgotten story, one buried beneath the empires that thought they could silence time.